Snow had been falling on Holloway's Reach for 3 days straight, and Henry Voss was tired of shoveling it. His boots left deep prints in the white ground as he walked from the barn to the house, a bucket of feed in one hand and a lantern in the other. The wind bit at his face, but he had lived through worse winters than this one. Out here, on the far edge of settled space, winters did not care how tired a man was. Henry was not old, but he was not young either. His hands were rough from years of fixing machines that should have been replaced long ago, and his back ached in a way it had not ached 10 years before. He lived alone on a stretch of land far from the nearest town, with only his animals and his tools for company. Some people thought that made him strange. Henry thought it made him free. That night, the sky did something Henry had never seen before. A streak of orange light cut across the clouds, too fast and too bright to be a shooting star. It came down hard, somewhere past the tree line near the old creek bed. The ground shook a little, just enough to rattle the windows of his house. Henry stood on his porch for a long moment, watching smoke rise into the storm. He knew he should stay inside. Whatever had fallen from the sky was not his business, and going out in a storm like this could get a man killed. But something about the smoke bothered him. It was not just about wreckage. Standing there in the wind, listening close, Henry thought he heard something under the noise of the storm. A high, thin sound, almost like crying. He told himself it was probably nothing. Whine through broken metal could sound like a lot of things. But the sound did not stop, and after a few minutes, Henry pulled on his coat, grabbed his lantern and a length of rope, and started walking toward the crash site. The walk took almost an hour through deep snow. By the time he reached the creek bed, his legs were numb and his lungs burned from the cold air. What he found there stopped him in his tracks. A small ship, no bigger than his own truck, lay broken open in the snow, one side torn like paper. Steam rose from a cracked engine near the back. The metal was not like anything Henry had ever seen, smooth and dark, with markings he did not recognize. The crying sound was louder now, and it was not the wind. Henry stepped closer, lantern raised, and saw them. 3 small creatures huddled together in the wreckage, pressed against each other for warmth. They had long necks, narrow snouts, and small folded wings pressed tight against their sides. Their scales were a dull green-gray, dusted with frost. One of them lifted its head at the sound of his boots crunching in the snow, and its eyes, large and pale gold, locked onto his. Henry had heard stories about creatures like this. Dragons, some called them, though nobody in these parts had ever seen one up close. Most of what people said about them was rumor and fear, talk of monsters from the sky that ate livestock and burned barns. Standing there in the cold, looking at 3 shivering, starving hatchlings barely bigger than dogs, none of that fear felt real anymore. What Henry saw was not a monster. It was 3 frightened children with nowhere to go and no one left to help them. He should have turned around. He should have gone back to his warm house, locked the door, and pretended he never heard that sound in the storm. Getting mixed up with alien creatures, especially unregistered ones, could bring trouble from every direction, from suspicious neighbors to government officials who did not take kindly to unclaimed extraterrestrial contact. Henry knew all of this. He thought about it for exactly as long as it took the smallest hatchling to let out another thin, exhausted cry. Then he set down his lantern, took off his coat, and wrapped it around the 3 of them as best he could. Carrying all 3 back was not easy. They were heavier than they looked, and they trembled the whole way, pressing close against his chest for warmth. Henry talked to them as he walked, low and steady, the way he might talk to a spooked horse. He did not know if they understood him, but the sound of a calm voice seemed to help. By the time he reached his house, his arms ached and his fingers had gone stiff, but the hatchlings had stopped crying. He laid them by the fire on an old blanket and got to work. He checked them for injuries as gently as he could, cleaned a few small cuts, and found some dried meat to offer them, unsure if it was even something they could eat. To his relief, they ate it eagerly, snapping it up with quick, careful bites. The smallest one, the one who had cried the loudest, fell asleep first, curled tight against the others. Henry sat back and looked at the 3 of them sleeping by his fire, and he let out a long breath. He had no idea what he had just gotten himself into. He did not know where they came from, why their ship had crashed, or if anyone was coming to look for them. All he knew was that outside, the storm was getting worse, and inside, for the first time in a long while, his house did not feel so empty. Whatever happened next, Henry decided he was not putting them back out in the cold. 3 weeks into caring for the hatchlings, Henry Voss had already rearranged half his house without meaning to. The old sitting room, once used for nothing but storing tools, was now a warm nest of blankets and heat lamps. His feed budget had doubled. He had started talking out loud to himself more than usual, except it was not really to himself anymore. The hatchlings had grown fast in those 3 weeks, faster than Henry thought possible. Their wings had filled out, no longer the thin, damp things he had first found in the snow. Their scales had brightened from dull gray-green to a deeper, richer color, almost like polished stone. Henry gave them names without really planning to, the way a person names things that end up staying. The boldest one, who was always first to explore and last to back down from anything, he called Rook. The quiet one, who liked to sit near the window and watch birds for hours, became Wren. The last one, sharp-eyed and always listening, always thinking, he named Sable. Talking to them had not been easy at first. They made sounds, low clicks and soft trills, but nothing Henry could understand. Still, he noticed things. When he spoke calmly, they relaxed. When he raised his voice, even by accident, they flinched and pressed together. Slowly, over days that turned into weeks, a kind of understanding grew between them, not through words exactly, but through patterns. A certain click from Rook meant hunger. A low hum from Wren meant she wanted to be near him. Sable's sharp little chirp, Henry learned, usually meant she had found something interesting and wanted him to look at it too. Henry was no scientist, but he was a careful man, and he began writing things down. He kept a notebook by the fire and filled it with small observations. How they slept curled together in a tight circle. How they seemed to sense storms before they arrived, growing restless hours ahead of any weather change. How, when he was tired or in pain from his aching back, all 3 of them would quiet down and stay close, almost as if they understood. Keeping them hidden was harder than raising them. Holloway's Reach was a small settlement, and word traveled fast even across long distances. Henry avoided trips into town when he could, and when he could not avoid it, he left the hatchlings locked safely inside with enough food and warmth to last the day. He told the few neighbors who asked that he was simply busy with repairs on his land. It was not entirely a lie. There was always something to repair. One evening, while mending a fence that had cracked under the weight of snow, Henry found something unusual near the edge of his property, not far from where the ship had crashed. Buried under a thin layer of frost was a small, smooth object, dark as the ship's hull, etched with the same strange markings he had seen before. It fit in his palm, and when he brushed off the last of the frost, it gave off a faint warmth, almost like a heartbeat. He brought it inside that night and set it on the table. The reaction from the hatchlings was immediate. All 3 of them went still, staring at the object with wide, golden eyes. Then, one by one, they approached it and lowered their heads, almost like a bow. Henry did not understand what he was looking at, but he understood enough to know it mattered to them. He wrapped it carefully in cloth and kept it safe, tucked away where no curious visitor would ever find it. As the weeks turned into months, Henry began to notice something else. The hatchlings were not just growing physically. They were changing in the way they carried themselves. Rook had started standing taller, chest out, as if practicing being brave. Wren had taken to following Henry step for step whenever he worked outside, watching everything he did with careful attention. Sable, meanwhile, had grown fiercely protective of the little object from the ship, staying close to it whenever it was out of its hiding place. Henry found himself talking to them more and more like they were people, not pets, not strange creatures he happened to be sheltering. He told them about his day. He explained why the fences needed fixing and how the seasons worked on Holloway's Reach. He was fairly certain they did not understand most of what he said, but they listened anyway, heads tilted, eyes following his every movement, and that was enough for him. There were nights when doubt crept in. Henry would sit by the fire, looking at the 3 sleeping shapes curled together, and wonder what he was really doing. He had no idea where they came from, what kind of world was looking for them, or what would happen if the wrong people ever learned they were here. Sheltering unregistered alien life was not just unusual. It could be dangerous, both for him and for them. But every time that doubt rose up, all it took was one soft hum from Wren, or Rook nudging his hand for attention, or Sable curling up quietly beside the strange little object from the wreck, and the doubt faded. Henry Voss had lived alone for a long time, and he had told himself he liked it that way. Watching the three of them grow, learn, and trust him a little more each day, he was starting to understand that he had been wrong about that for years. Whatever they were, wherever they had come from, they were his now, in every way that mattered. And Henry intended to protect that, no matter what it cost him. A truck engine rumbled up the road to Henry's house on a gray afternoon, and Henry knew before he even opened the door that trouble had finally found him. He recognized the vehicle. It belonged to Warden Colton, the regional official who handled land disputes, permits, and anything else the government thought needed watching in a place as remote as Holloway's reach. Colton rarely visited unless something was wrong, and he never smiled when he did. Henry stepped outside to meet him before Colton could reach the porch. Behind him, through the thin walls of the house, he could hear the faint shuffle of movement as the hatchlings, now much larger than when he had found them, settled deeper into the back room where he kept them hidden during visits. Colton did not waste time on pleasantries. He said there had been reports, strange lights months back near the creek bed, unusual tracks in the snow, and now rumors from a trader who claimed he had seen something large and scaled moving near Henry's fence line at dusk. Colton wanted to know if Henry had anything to say about that. Henry kept his voice steady and his face calm, the way he had learned to do over years of dealing with difficult customers and stubborn machines. He said the lights were probably just a passing meteor, and the tracks could belong to any number of wild animals that lived out past the tree line. Colton did not look convinced, but he did not push further, not that day. He warned Henry that if he found out anything unregistered alien life was being sheltered on his land, without proper reporting, there would be serious consequences, both for Henry and for whatever he was hiding. After Colton's truck disappeared down the road, Henry stood on his porch for a long time, thinking. He knew this would not be the end of it. Colton was not a cruel man, but he followed rules closely, and rules about alien contact were strict for a reason most people never questioned. If word got out that 3 young dragons were living on Henry's land, it would not just be Colton who came looking. Corporate interests, research groups, and worse would follow, all of them far less interested in the hatchlings' well-being than in what they might be worth. That night, Henry sat with Rook, Wren, and Sable and tried to explain the danger as best he could, using the mix of words and gestures they had built together over the months. He was not sure how much they understood, but their reaction told him they understood enough. Rook's stance grew rigid, protective. Wren pressed close to Henry's side. Sable's eyes moved toward the hidden object from the wreck, the one they always guarded so carefully. 3 days later, in the dead of night, Henry woke to the sound of an engine that did not belong to Colton's truck. Through his window, he saw unfamiliar lights sweeping across his land, moving slow and deliberate, like someone searching. He did not wait to find out who it was. He moved fast, waking the hatchlings and guiding them toward the old storm shelter dug into the hillside behind his barn, a space he had built years ago for tornado season and never expected to use for anything like this. The search did not take long to find the house, but Henry was ready. He met the 2 strangers at his door before they could go further, a man and a woman in plain gray uniforms carrying handheld scanners that hummed softly in the night air. They claimed to be investigating unregistered energy signatures in the area. Henry played the part of a confused, irritated farmer disturbed in the middle of the night, insisting he had no idea what they were talking about and demanding to see proper authorization for searching his property. It worked, but only barely. The scanners picked up faint traces near the barn, close enough to the shelter to make Henry's chest tighten with fear. The strangers exchanged a look and moved toward the barn despite Henry's protests. That was when Rook made his choice. The hatchling, now large enough to stand nearly as tall as Henry's shoulder, burst from the shelter and let out a sound Henry had never heard before, a sharp, powerful cry that echoed across the open land and sent both strangers stumbling backward in shock. Wren and Sable followed close behind, wings spread wide, forming a line between the intruders and the shelter entrance. It was not an attack. It was a warning, clear and unmistakable. 3 young dragons standing their ground to protect the only home they had ever known. The strangers did not linger. Whether out of fear or simple lack of orders to engage a full confrontation, they retreated to their vehicle and left as quickly as they had come, though not before their scanners caught a final, damning reading. Henry knew that night would not be forgotten. Whoever they worked for now had proof that something extraordinary lived on his land. In the chaos of their retreat, one of the strangers' vehicles clipped the corner of Henry's barn, tearing through the old wooden frame and collapsing part of the roof. Henry stood in the wreckage afterward, looking at the damage under the moonlight. The hatchlings gathered close around him, still breathing hard from the encounter. He should have been angry about the barn. Instead, looking at Rook standing tall and protective, Wren pressed nervously against his leg, and Sable watching the road with sharp, wary eyes. All Henry felt was a fierce, aching pride. Whatever came next, he was not facing it alone anymore, and neither were they. Years had a way of passing quietly out on Holloway's reach, and Henry Voss had let a great many of them slip by without noticing. His hair had gone mostly gray. His hands, once merely rough, now carried the deep lines of a man who had spent a lifetime working land that never gave anything easily. The barn Colton's people had damaged all those years ago had been patched more times than Henry could count. Its wood mismatched and weathered, held together by stubbornness as much as nails. Rook, Wren, and Sable were no longer hatchlings. They had grown into full-sized adults, their bodies powerful and their wings wide enough to blot out the sun when they flew. Rook had become the strongest of the three, broad-shouldered and steady, always first to check the fences or clear fallen branches from the road. Wren had grown sleek and quick, spending long hours scouting the skies around the property, always watching for trouble before it arrived. Sable had grown sharp-minded and watchful, still fiercely protective of the small object from the wreck, which she now carried tucked safely within a pouch of hardened scale near her chest. They had learned to hide well over the years, staying close to the house during the day and only venturing far at night, when the chances of being seen were lowest. Even so, life on the frontier had worn Henry down in ways the dragons could not fix no matter how much they wanted to. His house creaked louder every winter. His fences leaned further with each passing storm. He was not a young man anymore, and the work of running a homestead alone, even with 3 grown dragons for company, had begun to show in every corner of his land. It was on a quiet afternoon, while Henry sat mending a torn boot on his porch, that Wren returned from her usual patrol with an urgency none of them had seen from her before. She landed hard, wings snapping shut, and let out a series of sharp calls that brought Rook and Sable rushing from the fields. Henry stood slowly, watching all 3 of them stare toward the sky in the direction Wren had come from. He followed their gaze and saw it, a shape far larger than anything that had ever crossed the skies of Holloway's reach, moving steady and deliberate above the clouds. It was not one ship. It was many, arranged in careful formation, descending toward the old creek bed where, decades ago, a single broken escape pod had first crashed into the snow. Henry's chest tightened with a fear he had not felt in years. He had always known this day might come, that somewhere out among the stars, someone might still be looking for 3 lost hatchlings. He looked at Rook, Wren, and Sable, and saw something unexpected in their eyes, not fear, but recognition. The ships landed with a grace that spoke of far greater technology than anything Henry had ever seen. When the hatches opened, figures emerged, dozens of them, tall and powerful, scaled in colors Henry could hardly describe, deep blues and burnished golds that caught the fading afternoon light like polished armor. At the front of them walked one figure in particular, older, marked with faded scars across one wing, moving with the unmistakable bearing of someone used to being obeyed. Henry stood his ground on his porch as the group approached, Rook, Wren, and Sable moving to stand beside him, not behind him. That single choice, the way the 3 of them placed themselves at his side rather than retreating to safety, seemed to catch the newcomers off guard. Murmurs passed among them, low and uncertain. The lead figure stopped a short distance away and studied Henry with sharp, ancient eyes. He introduced himself through a small device that translated his words into rough but understandable speech as Elder Rask, and he did not waste time with pleasantries. He said his people had been searching for 3 lost hatchlings for many years, ever since a transport carrying them had gone missing during an attack on their homeworld. He said all hope of finding them had nearly been abandoned. Then Rask's eyes moved past Henry, to Rook, Wren, and Sable, and something in his rigid posture shifted, just slightly. Sable stepped forward first, reaching into her scale pouch and withdrawing the small object Henry had found buried in the frost so many years ago. She held it out toward Rask, who stared at it in stunned silence before speaking words that needed no translation, low and reverent. It took time and careful explanation through halting words and gestures for the full story to come together. Rask and his people had assumed the hatchlings lost in the crash had died in the wreckage or the storm that followed. To learn that not only had they survived, but had been raised safely, protected, and loved by a single human farmer on a distant frontier world was almost beyond what Rask seemed able to process. His gaze moved over Henry's worn house, the patched barn, the leaning fences, all clear signs of years spent stretching too little to cover too much, made harder still by the danger his people's missing children had unknowingly brought to this man's door. Rask's expression grew heavier as understanding settled in. Henry, uncertain what any of this meant for him or for the family he had built, simply said the truth as plainly as he knew how. He said he had not done anything special. He had just done what anyone should do for 3 scared children left alone in the snow. Elder Rask was quiet for a long moment, looking between Henry and the 3 dragons standing loyally at his side. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried a weight that made even the ground beneath them seem to still. He said a debt like this could never be repaid with words. By the time the sun rose the next morning over Holloway's Reach, Henry's quiet stretch of frontier land looked nothing like it had the night before. Dozens of Talvarai moved across the property with quiet purpose, some carrying tools unlike anything Henry had ever seen, others directing streams of light and sound that seemed to reshape the ground itself. What should have taken a human construction crew months was already well underway before Henry had even finished his morning coffee. He stood on his porch, still in his sleep clothes, watching in stunned silence as his old, sagging barn was carefully taken apart piece by piece, not with destruction, but with a kind of respectful precision, as though even the wood that had sheltered his tools for decades deserved to be handled with care. Nearby, Rook stood directing a small group of workers, his voice carrying easily over the noise, clearly at ease with a level of authority Henry had never seen from him before. Elder Rask found Henry not long after, standing quietly beside him as they both watched the work unfold. Rask explained, in his slow, careful way, that among his people, a debt owed to hatchlings was treated as sacred, higher even than debts between adults. The idea that a stranger had risked everything, comfort, safety, even his standing among his own people, to protect 3 frightened, orphaned children with nothing to offer in return, was something the Talvarai considered one of the highest acts a person could perform. He said the clan did not intend to simply thank Henry with words. They intended to repay the debt in the way their culture demanded, fully, and without half measures. Over the following days, Henry watched his old, weathered homestead transform into something he barely recognized. The house itself, which had leaned slightly to one side for as long as he could remember, was carefully lifted and reinforced with materials far stronger than anything available on Holloway's Reach. New rooms were added, built to human proportions, but with details clearly shaped by dragon craftsmanship, wide doorways for wings, high ceilings for comfort, and a great open room near the back specifically designed for 3 large dragons to rest together, as they always had. Ren spent much of her time working alongside a small group tasked with reshaping the fences and fields, her sharp eyes ensuring nothing was placed carelessly, nothing that might disturb the land Henry had spent his life shaping. Sable, meanwhile, stayed close to the old creek bed, overseeing the careful, respectful removal of what remained of the original crashed ship, treating the site with the same reverence someone might show an old grave. Word of the strange, extraordinary work happening on Henry's land spread quickly through Holloway's Reach, and it was not long before Warden Colton himself arrived, tires kicking up dust as he pulled up faster than usual. Henry braced himself for confrontation, but what he saw on Colton's face when he stepped out of his truck was not anger. It was something closer to disbelief. Colton stood at the edge of the property, watching as a group of Talvarai carefully repaired a stretch of road that had been cracked and uneven for as long as anyone in the region could remember, work that would have taken a government crew weeks completed in what looked like hours. He turned to Henry, opened his mouth as if to say something official, something about permits or reports, and then simply closed it again, shaking his head slowly. Henry explained everything to him plainly. The crash so many years ago, the choice he had made that night in the snow, the years of quiet care that followed, and the danger that had eventually found its way to his door because of it. He did not ask for forgiveness or approval. He simply told the truth and let Colton decide what to do with it. Colton was quiet for a long time, watching the work continue around them. Finally, he said that whatever forms needed filing could wait. He said he had never in his life seen anything built with that kind of care, and he was not about to be the reason it stopped. By the time the work was finished, Henry's homestead had become something far greater than the sum of its old, worn parts. The house stood strong and proud against the horizon, built to last through storms that would have crumbled the old structure in a single season. The barn had been rebuilt twice as large, strong enough to weather anything the frontier could throw at it. The fields stretched wider and healthier than they had in years, and the road leading to his door was smooth and solid beneath his boots for the first time in his memory. Standing at the center of it all, surrounded by dozens of Talvarai finishing their final touches, Henry felt something he had not expected to feel. It was not just gratitude. It was the quiet, overwhelming realization that the small kindness he had shown 3 frightened hatchlings in the snow so many years ago had grown into something far larger than he ever could have imagined. Elder Rask approached him one final time as the work drew to a close, studying the transformed homestead with clear satisfaction. He told Henry that a debt this deep could never truly be settled, not fully, but he hoped this would stand as proof that his people never forgot kindness, no matter how small it seemed at the time it was given. Henry looked around at his rebuilt home, at Rook, Wren, and Sable standing proudly nearby, and found he had no words good enough to answer that. Autumn came gently to Halloway's Reach that year, painting the fields around Henry's rebuilt homestead in shades of gold and deep red. Where once there had been only the sound of wind against old, tired boards, now the property hummed with quiet activity, both human and Talvarai moving comfortably across land that had become something neither people had ever seen before, a true meeting place between 2 very different worlds. Elder Rask's clan had not left after the rebuilding was finished. A portion of them stayed on, settling into a section of land near the creek bed that Henry had gladly offered, the same spot where a single broken escape pod had first crashed into the snow so many years before. Over time, simple dwellings rose there, built in the Talvarai style but respectful of the human land around them, and slowly, cautiously, the people of Halloway's Reach began to grow used to seeing dragons overhead as a normal part of daily life. It had not been easy at first. Fear does not disappear overnight, and there were plenty of neighbors who kept their distance, who whispered about the wisdom of living so close to creatures most had only ever heard about in frightening stories. But fear has a way of fading when faced with simple, repeated proof that the stories were wrong. It was hard to stay afraid of Wren, who spent her afternoons helping local children search for their lost pets from the sky, spotting them from high above and guiding them home with soft, patient calls. It was hard to fear Rook, who had become something of a local legend for his willingness to help repair storm damage across the region, lifting fallen trees and broken fences with ease that no human crew could match. Sable, meanwhile, had taken on a quieter role, one that suited her sharp, careful mind. She became something like a bridge between the 2 peoples, spending long hours with Warden Colton and other local officials, helping smooth over the countless small misunderstandings that came with 2 very different cultures learning to share the same land. Colton, once so wary of anything unregistered or unexplained, had become, in his own gruff way, one of the Talvarai's staunchest defenders in matters of local government. Henry, for his part, had settled into a role he never expected for himself. He was not a leader, not truly, not in the way Elder Rask was for his people. But he had become something just as important, a trusted voice between 2 worlds, someone both sides knew they could turn to when tensions rose or misunderstandings threatened to unravel the fragile peace they had built together. He spent his days much as he always had, tending his fields and fixing what needed fixing, except now his mornings often began with Wren circling low over the house to check on him, and his evenings often ended with Rook and Sable settling nearby. close as they had been since they were small. One evening, as the sun sank low behind the hills, painting the sky in deep orange and purple, Henry sat on the porch of his rebuilt home, a home stronger and greater than anything he had built alone, and looked out over land that had changed so much from the quiet, lonely place it once was. Elder Rasp joined him there, as he often did in the evenings, and the two of them sat together in comfortable silence, watching the last light fade over fields shared by both their peoples. Rask spoke first, saying that in all his years he had never expected to find peace on a world so far from his own, nor had he expected that peace to be built on the simple kindness of one tired farmer who had chosen to open his door on a stormy night rather than close it. He said the story of Henry and the three hatchlings had already begun to spread among his people, told and retold as an example of what true kindness could accomplish when given without expectation of anything in return. Henry, never comfortable with too much praise, simply shrugged and said he had only done what felt right at the time. He said he never imagined it would lead to any of this, a rebuilt home, a lasting friendship between two entire peoples, or three children who had grown into some of the strongest, most loyal souls he had ever known. As if summoned by the thought, Rook, Wren, and Sable arrived together, landing softly in the yard before making their way up to join Henry and Rask on the porch, settling close around them the way they always had, even now, fully grown and powerful enough to level mountains if they chose. To Henry, they would always be the three frightened hatchlings he had carried home through the snow, wrapped in his own coat against the cold. Looking around at his home, his family, and the quiet, growing peace stretching out across the land he had once tended alone, Henry Voss found himself thinking that he had never set out to change anything. He had only wanted to help three scared children find shelter from a storm. Sometimes, he realized, the smallest choices carried the greatest weight, echoing far beyond anything a person could ever have imagined on the night they were made. And as the stars began to rise over Holloway's Reach, casting their pale light over a home rebuilt through gratitude and love, Henry understood, at last, that he had never truly been alone.